My name's Avery Slater. I'm Associate Professor at the University of Toronto's Department of English and Drama, and I'm a research lead with the Schwartz-Friesman Institute for Technology and Society. I'm very excited to moderate today's seminar featuring our guest speaker and the University of Toronto's very own, Anastasia Kuzminykh. Welcome. So before we begin today's session, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, the University of Toronto has been located on the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. We're grateful to have the opportunity to live and work on this land. While some of us may be joining from different places today on this Zoom call, we invite you to reflect on the history and relations of the land that you are on. Just a few of our usual logistics as we begin. This session is recorded. Our speaker will present for about 50 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A. During the Q&A, we do encourage participants to engage. You can use the raise hand function in the Zoom meeting controls. It's under React. And you can also type your question in the chat, and we'll try to get to those in the order they're received. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speaker for today, Anastasia Kuzminykh, an assistant professor in human-computer interaction at the University of Toronto's Faculty of Information. Anastasia is also cross-appointed with the Department of Computer Science, and she's a faculty affiliate with SRI and associate director of the Knowledge Media Design Institute, or KMDI, and the head of the Cookie Group, an interdisciplinary research lab whose work explores diverse technologies, including conversational agents, topic for today's discussion, large language models, generative AI systems, and AI-based decision support systems. Anastasia's work focuses on human-computer interaction and information dynamics, analyzing complex communication environments and designing systems to advance user performance. Her current research interests center on human interaction with AI systems, particularly human agent communication, supported through conversational user interfaces. She's interested in how users perceive AI systems and how these perceptions affect information exchange processes, how people organize information through conversational interfaces, and how we can design ethical and efficient human-AI collaboration. So we're very delighted to have Anastasia with us today and looking forward to her presentation entitled The Power of Discussion, Designing Useful Communication with AI Agents. So without further ado, Anastasia, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Just give me a second. I'll share my screen. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, hello everyone. Thank you so much, Avery, for the introduction. So I'm Anastasia Kuzminykh, and although my PhD is in computer science, and for the last many years, I'm an HCI researcher and systems design researcher. Before that, I worked in anthropology and then cognitive and neuropsychology, and I was always interested in communication processes. And over time, I became interested in this notion of humans and technical systems as communicative entities. And now at the University of Toronto, I lead the research group called COOKIE, which stands for Communication, Organization of Knowledge, and Information Ecosystems. And in our work, we do research on human-AI interaction with the overall goal of developing an efficient collaborative communication between humans and AI. Because I believe that our two types of intelligence are truly complementary. And the future of our collaborating depends on the quality of our communication. Now, why do I say human-AI communication when we have a perfectly good term, human-computer interaction, which we have been using for over 40 years? If AI is just a computer, what's the difference? So in classical, conventional interaction, we have our human and a machine. And for a defined input from a human, such as, let's say, pressing a button, there is a defined outcome from a machine. And this is the way how most classical user interfaces work in a nutshell. This is what we all know well. And this interaction can be happening in any modality, let's say pressing a button, shaking your phone, making a gesture, typing a command, or even using simple voice commands, something like turn off my alarm or what's 274 divided by 0.5. However, between a human and an AI system, there is something else going on. While indeed AI is, of course, also a machine, now there is a perceived agency on the receiving side, which is a perceived capacity of AI to act independently and to make its own quote-unquote free choices. And because of this capacity of the system to make choices, I, as a user, can expect variations in interpretation of my actions, in how the system chooses to interpret me. And now, for a given input, the output might significantly vary. For example, with classical human-computer interaction, when I press a button, I don't need to think whether the system might think I'm happy or stressed or in a rush, or what is particularly important for me, or how knowledgeable I am in the topic. I would expect the same outcome every time, and it's easy to predict. With AI, I need to take into account how the system is going to interpret my input. Because of it, I start changing different properties of such input, trying to affect the system's interpretation. In other words, the meaning of my input suddenly becomes contextually dependent. So I will be giving input in one way in one context and in a different way in a different context. And similarly, of course, the system's output would become contextually defined rather than predetermined. And in my research, I suggest that this aspect of context dependency, the context-dependent encoding, and the flexibility of interpretation are what makes human-AI interaction, in fact, the case of communication. And this flexibility changes pretty much everything. So on the one hand, this difference is essential for true collaboration because it allows us to move from a command, from telling a system what exactly to do, to a request, an expression of a need or desire that we have. For example, instead of telling a system to label a piece of data as X, I would tell it something like, I need to figure out the best label for this piece of data, suggest me some options. And this working together with the system towards a common goal is basically what true collaboration is in its essence. And in my work, I look at the collaboration between human and AI through this prism of communication. And I argue that the effectiveness and the quality of human-AI collaboration is predicated on the ability of humans and AI to effectively communicate. So their ability to understand each other and efficiently present the information to each other. And to explain what I mean, we're going to have to make this diagram just a tiny bit more nuanced. And my goal for today is to give you an overview of a human-AI communication cycle. So I'm going to tell you right away, it is an overview talk, but I want to highlight some of the associated threats and challenges to the collaboration quality. And I'll be providing some examples of how communication architecture and the design of communication processes can both cause and address these collaboration issues. So let's start from the beginning. And of course, the process starts with the user forming and presenting to the system some communicative input. So it's the user's process of prompt engineering. By now, it's more or less universally accepted that a well-crafted prompt is a key for the success of the collaboration process. It bridges this gap between human thinking and machine processing. And if it is well formulated, it of course leads to more accurate, relevant, useful outputs. And now you can find 1,000,001 video on YouTube or TikTok and so on that would be sharing best ways to prompt LLMs, for example. Because of course, a well-engineered prompt guides the AI to generate more precise and better quality responses that better align with the user's goals. Sounds great. What's the issue? Well, first of all, as people started actively using Gen AI systems, we suddenly, well, actually not so suddenly, but we found that there is a gap between a human goals, human high-level understanding of what they want, and their ability to formulate effective prompts that would actually leverage this model's capabilities. And more specifically, there is something that we now refer to as the instruction gap, which is the challenge, the difficulty of providing clear and effective prompts to achieve one's goal. Because remember, the user must mentally simulate and predict how the LLM will interpret their prompt and what specific wording or what formatting will lead to a better outcome. To add to these issues, information is expressed differently in different modalities, for example, in text, in voice, in images, sounds, and so on. For example, in one of our projects, we were developing a collaborative chart authoring system, so a system that would help creating different charts. And that system was supposed to allow users to provide voice conversational input. And while, of course, other natural language systems for chart authoring have been developed in the past, they were predominantly designed around text-based input. And interestingly, when we empirically examined and compared the structure and the content of voice and text prompts, and for chart creation in this case, we found that voice descriptions have a significantly higher variety of prompt formats, element characteristics, linguistic features compared to the text prompts. So in red on the slide, you can see the only structural overlaps between text and voice prompts. For example, in voice descriptions, we observed the use of iterative commands to perform tasks for each element, or references to the elements created earlier, or advice requests, corrections of previously created elements, and so on. So what does it mean? Well, it shows that people are, surprise, surprise, not particularly consistent, and they express their needs, so they formulate their prompts differently in different modalities. While they have the same goal behind these prompts, they would be expressing it differently. And things get even more complicated when we are combining different modalities, as many models now are trying to do. Because this combination of modalities, this multimodality input, requires users to, again, predict and simulate how the model will be integrating and interpreting information from diverse data streams, which is not really transparent and actually challenging even for the models themselves to figure out. So these issues, of course, increase complexity of formulating prompts and increase the instruction gap, which I mentioned earlier. Another big challenge that that has received a lot of attention recently is that we haven't yet figured out how to properly design conversational navigation and control for the systems. What we would typically find in settings or menus when using classical graphic interfaces. For example, for general purpose conversational agents, this is associated with the issue of so-called low discoverability, which means that users have difficulties figuring out what a system can actually do. What are the functionalities for these systems? So in one of our projects, we empirically identified the attributes that allow to group the unbounded set of functionalities, and we showed that users consistently apply multiple attributes, which means that we need to be able to support these attributes simultaneously, and this is great because voice instructions allow us to do that. But based on these results, we proposed a new approach of the conversational faceted gradual information representation. And this method allows basically to guide users in their conversational prompt engineering when they're navigating and exploring models' capabilities. And we see that without any guidance, users have significant difficulty providing clear and effective system control prompts to achieve their corresponding goals. But now let's say somehow we help the user to formulate their prompt, and the next step is for the system to recognize the corresponding communicative intent behind this prompt. So what is that user actually wants from the system? And of course, correct intent recognition is essential for quality human-AI collaboration because it enables the system to truly grasp the user's goal, right? So it is important for accuracy, for efficiency, for the overall relevance of the response. And immediately we see that the flip side of the flexibility of human-AI communication is the issue of prompt ambiguity. And while some ambiguity is caused by the challenges we discussed earlier, so let's say the instruction gap, where people are just not sure how to express what they want, let's say in creative processes, ambiguity is also just an inherent characteristic of human language. For example, we're currently working with a visiting researcher, Dr. Chanwook Park from LG, on a project on how to properly disambiguate human commands issued to a robot planner in home environments. And there are different ways of resolving prompt ambiguity. For example, models can be using some enhanced reasoning or user-specific memory, but also some of these ambiguities can only be resolved through asking users clarifying question. And so immediately there is an issue of how can we identify which ambiguities should be resolved automatically and based on what strategies, which have to trigger, let's say, some safety considerations, and which have to be clarified with the user. Furthermore, to produce this accurate and relevant intent recognition, AI must understand the broader circumstances of the conversation. And these difficulties get particular attention now with the active development of agentic AI, when more and more AI agents are being embedded directly into domain workflows. So let's say in some enterprise tools, rather than being developed as isolated chatbots. But what information is relevant? What information needs to be abstracted and how to do it properly? So all these questions are yet to be figured out. And it's also an interesting observation, that our most recent research on the user's sense of ownership over AI agents shows the significant effects of both the ability to properly disambiguate and the ability to interpret users' context. So the better the agent can address these two issues, the more users feel that the agent is theirs. Once the system recognizes the user's intent, then it needs to process and produce information according to this intent. I'm not going to go into too much detail here because it's less directly related to the conversational architecture specifically, but I just want to mention that that is where the evaluation of models come in. So let's say nuances of data curation requirements also would be here. And of course, a big issue here are the biases that can be introduced through training data, through flaws in the algorithmic design, as one of our publications here shows up, or let's say careless engineering choices during the model development. And another very hot topic in this area is related to the need for human-centered benchmarking. So something that would allow us to move beyond these purely technical metrics like accuracy or speed, to be able to assess how well the model aligns with human needs, values, different collaboration requirements in different contexts, and so on. Once the model processed and produced the information, it then needs to format this information for human understanding and to communicate it back to the user. And immediately a big question here that many researchers right now are working on is how to properly communicate the model's confidence, which is often not necessarily sky high. Previously, in AI systems, often confidence would be communicated through just graphical outputs with some numerical meanings, numerical values assigned to that. However, in conversational interactions, it becomes significantly more complicated. And let's say LLMs have a tendency to sound overconfident and even when presenting incorrect information. And when users have this uncalibrated trust in LLMs, so let's say tend to overtrust it, they're much more likely to accept not perfect outputs without particularly critical review, which of course leads to poor or even dangerous decisions. So in my group, we looked into designing trust calibration through communicating these levels of uncertainty using paralinguistic cues in agent speech. So just the way an agent pronounces the information. And to understand how voice-based agents can actually do that, we first wanted to see how people use speech cues to conversationally express different levels of certainty. We specifically looked at 3 certainty levels, low, medium, and high. And through a long process, we found a set of different cues, and we also found that people use them in different combinations and variations of these cues to express low and high confidence. We also showed through the clustering of these cues, we showed that there are more ways that people use and combine these cues to express high certainty than to express low certainty, which means that there is more agreement on how to express low certainty, which is fantastic for us because this is the most important information that we would like to convey. Low certainty is much more dangerous than high certainty in collaborative situations. So we then wanted to see, can people actually recognize levels of certainty when hearing these cues back? Can they properly interpret it in human-human and human-agent communication? And we found first that it is easier to recognize low certainty than high certainty, which again is great news for us. And we also found that people consistently had troubles distinguishing between phrases with high and medium certainty, which is slightly less great news, which means that we need to find additional ways of conveying those differences. And that was true both for human-human and human-agent conversation. But most interestingly, we found that when the same information was expressed in the same way, it was perceived as less certain when coming from agents than from humans. Why is that interesting? Because as now we keep developing more human-sounding agents, we have to account for those differences in interpretation if we want to make sure that we are conveying the levels of certainty properly through the interaction. Another important issue in the way how we format our output from the AI system is user-specific format alignment. When researchers just started talking about alignment issues, it was predominantly associated with alignment of values or alignment of ethical considerations. However, the way the information is presented also requires alignment processes. Why? A generic output format would be functional, of course, but it can be difficult for users, let's say, to integrate into their workflow or sometimes to even understand. This formatting includes things like, let's say, complexity of language used in, let's say, text output, the use of terminology, writing styles, formats of information presentation like bullet points or diagrams or illustrations or essay type texts. And by aligning the output format to user preferences and user requirements, LLMs, of course, become more tailored, which is especially important in highly sensitive domains, environments. Let's say when we're designing agents for medical environments where they need to communicate this information to patients, let's say about the diagnosis or some treatment processes, it is important to ensure that the information aligns with the requirements for the understanding on the user side. Now, sounds pretty straightforward. Why is that an issue? Because we don't really know how to do that yet. How to identify what those user-specific needs are. Let's say, how can a model assume a desired level of language complexity if it is not specifically prompted by a user? There are different approximations that researchers are trying to use, such as, let's say, demographic data. But first of all, they introduce and reinforce social biases and inequalities. But also, they frankly don't work very well, and they don't yield particularly good results. So the basis for this format alignment largely remains an open question. However, it is more and more recognized as a necessary step for the post hoc formation of the output. And finally here, there is a question of sycophancy. It's a very hot topic. What is sycophancy? It's the tendency of a large language model to agree with the user or to flatter the user, even when the user might be wrong or, let's say, presenting some clearly biased information. Why is that happening? It wasn't designed on purpose. It is a result of the way how models are trained and the fact that they're rewarded for being pleasing, basically rewarded for being helpful. And of course, that leads to prioritization of agreement over factual accuracy of the output. Sycophancy is generally considered problematic because, of course, it undermines the reliability, the trustworthiness of AI systems. It reinforces biases. And currently, the way we manage that is sycophantic behavior, is either through prompt engineering or through fine-tuning of models that we're working with, which of course is not always directly accessible to a typical user. It is even more complicated because sycophantic behavior is not purely negative. We as humans, let's say, tend to use some aspects of it as well, just let's say to establish some social rapport when in our communication, right? When we want to look friendly and to communicate our positive intent. So one of the directions that we are currently exploring is how can we learn to recognize and communicate the level of sycophancy rather than trying to purely eliminate it. There is some recent evidence that people actually start seeing the agents as very cold and abrupt when developers are trying to get rid of sycophancy purely on the model side. So there is an interesting direction in research right now, trying to figure out how can we communicate the levels of sycophancy and what would be the effects of that on the interaction. So speaking of the effects, once the output was formed, the next step is to pass it to the user. And that, of course, affects the user perceptions, both of the information that was communicated and of the system itself. And corresponding to the trust calibration issue in output formation, first here we see the issue of how reliable and objective the information is perceived. People generally are pretty bad at distinguishing objective and subjective information, or distinguishing facts and opinions, particularly when both are expressed through a regular conversational format. So what aspects of the model's output architecture and structure affect these perceptions? Or what aspects, for example, affect the perception of information trustworthiness? In one of our projects, which started as a project on explainable AI, we looked at it in the context of human AI collaborative decision-making in situations when there is no ground truth. So something that we call subjective decision-making, where many outputs are possible. In particular, we looked at content moderation decisions when the decision itself was whether a given content was sexist or not. So we give participants a set of potentially sexist scenarios with the suggested decision and an accompanying rationale produced by either a human or AI, but participants didn't know which one is which. And we asked whether people think the explanation was generated by a human or by AI model and why. And we also asked them to rate the rationale on 3 qualities: relevance, convincingness, and trustworthiness. And I invite you to read more about it in the paper itself because it's a pretty large manuscript. But in short, we found a set of rational characteristics, and we showed that they generally fall under either tone, which is emotionality, formality, neutrality, grammatical elements, such as, let's say, length or type of grammar used, argumentative sophistication, including source of argument, argument structure, relation to scenario, and relation to user, which is alignment to personal experiences and alignment with personal stance. And this relation to user played a strongly positive role in all 3 evaluation categories, suggesting an extremely concerning confirmation bias. And it also sets some very critical boundaries on what and how should be learned by the model when training on user acceptance data points, as many models right now do. It also raises important questions on the role of subjectivity in LLM evaluation, which goes to the 3rd step of the cycle. We also found that the effects of all these characteristics depend on the perceived author, whether it is believed to be written by a human or by AI. The effects, in a sense, of whether these characteristics make an explanation rationale to be perceived more relevant or less relevant, more trustworthy or less trustworthy, and so on. So these results show that there are particular mechanisms of how the structure and the format of AI output affects the user perceptions, which means that, for example, if we want to be able to control the overly confident output or catch output that would trigger inadequately high trust, we can use this identified linguistic characteristics as a basis for the recognition processes and the filtering mechanisms. Of course, I cannot not mention the questions associated with the anthropomorphized perceptions. Particularly recently, there has been a very active interest in the development of more anthropomorphized agents. And in fact, we had a panel here at SRI on this topic earlier in September. So anthropomorphized perceptions, or these tendencies to attribute human-like, lifelike characteristics to AI systems, bring many advantages for collaboration. So, for example, people are more likely to engage, more likely to interact because it is the technology feels more social, more familiar. It also helps to reduce cognitive load for users because it makes interaction more intuitive and the systems mimic familiar behaviors. But of course, it also has some threats associated with it. Let's say inappropriate anthropomorphization can lead to false expectations, let's say on emotional responses, or it can lead to overly emotional connections or some misplaced trust. So what does it mean? It means that we need to be careful with designing anthropomorphized reactions. But to be careful, we need to know how to control these perceptions. And since these agents communicate using natural language, one of the key factors shaping users' perceptions is what the agent says and how it says it, right? So the conversational architecture. So it would be very useful to know how to develop this agent's speech to control these perceptions, right? And this is exactly what we did in one of our early collaboration projects with Naver AI Labs, working with Dr. Yang-Ho Kim. So again, we knew that as users interact with agents, they form different perceptions of an agent, like whether it's intelligent or likable. But there was no systematic understanding of how the conversational architecture affects these perceptions. So how do I need to synthesize this speech to actually get to one or another perception on the user side? So with that, we first wanted to understand what are the perceptions associated with the variations in speech? what elements of speech of this conversational architecture affect these perceptions, and of course, what is known about the relationship between the two. And here's what we found. So first, we found that the perceptions of agents, there are four main groups of those perceptions. One is on the overall interaction quality, which includes, let's say, engagement, capturing emotional reactions from users, user satisfaction. The other one is agent's ability, which is its intelligence, competence, and credibility, so perceived truthfulness and benevolence. The third one is sociability of an agent. So how socially present it is, how warm it is towards the user. And finally, perceptions of agents' humanness, so how human-like it is, and different personality traits. And in terms of what affects these perceptions, it either falls under a social dialogue strategy, using social dialogue, or including, let's say, response delays, content effectiveness, content style, let's say how formal it is or how elaborate the answers are, and speech formatting. So let's say using disfluencies, using prosody, and other characteristics like that. And so we found that in current literature, in current research, the perceptions of CA abilities, so let's say intelligence, credibility, have been explored the least, while they are arguably the most important for the collaborative process. That kind of makes, and what was explored the most is general usability and satisfaction. That somewhat makes sense, because general perceptions, such as engagement and satisfaction, are probably the easiest to explore out of this set. But of course, we need to have more mechanisms of affecting the appropriate perception of the agent's credibility, of the agent's competence and intelligence. These perceptions of the information that the agent provides and the system itself, formed in situ based on the agent's output, of course, influence the user's mental models and beliefs about the system overall. One of the actively discussed issues in that step is the illusion of sentience on the system side. That is directly related to the anthropomorphized perceptions. I'm not going to stop on that right now. Again, I want to direct you to the panel, the recording of which should be on the SRI website. But I want to highlight here some other aspects related to mental models. First, there are significant difficulties for users to form perceptions of system abilities, something that we call the intentionality gap. With traditional software, people can have, as we mentioned earlier, predictable output. But with AI systems, there is no clear benchmark of what is good or what is bad. So let's say when you get a particular output from the system, it's very difficult for a user to evaluate, is it the best that it can do? Is there something I can change to have it better? Except just engaging in constant trial and error process, which is extremely cognitively demanding. Also, it's never clear when to stop with this process. This is an open challenge that there are different approaches right now that exist in research in addressing that. But overall, it all comes down to the way the agent should be communicating information back to the user and what additional meta information should be included together with the main content of the output. And another issue that I would like to draw your particular attention to is on how the perceptions of system processes are formed for users. And I'll do it on the example of our recent study on the user's understanding and expectations around agents' long-term memory. Memory is a very complicated phenomenon in this case because we are so familiar with this process from our human life that we associate a lot of that we can translate a lot of the expectations with memory on the agent processes, which are, of course, completely different. Memory is required for a long-term co-understanding and for long-term efficient interaction, but we know very little on how people think about this long-term memory in agents. So to address that, through the user interviews and the analysis of publicly available posts, we explored what are these people's mental models and expectations on AI memory systems. What are the needs that people have in association with these memory processes, and what are the current practices on how people manage the long-term memory in personalized AI systems. And our findings showed that users generally do not consider all types of agents' memory to be equal, and their needs for the system to remember certain information evolves over time, depending on the domain, task, and the stage of the task that the user is working on with the agent. And for this reason, participants use different ways of organizing, people use different ways of organizing the system's memories through different means. For example, creating separate chat threads for different tasks, organizing chats with similar tasks into folders of this higher level projects, creating separate agents and separate personas for the same agent for different tasks and different roles, fine-tuning the model to specialize it toward a specific domain, logging in to different user accounts, so let's say to change the user-related memories, and changing the base model in use. So in order to change the system base capabilities, which of course is not ideal. And so the examples of some design opportunities here are, let's say, in addition to the time-based or semantic-based retrieval of memories that are supported right now by many existing systems, the user's current task or activity might also be an important context cue for the system to determine what information to retrieve from memory and what formation of those memories should be. And there is also opportunity for systems to provide mechanisms for the user to organize memories into their own user-defined groups and can manually set the system's levels of access to these memories. So what we used to call, even several years ago, explainable AI was focused on explanations for how a particular decision or prediction or an outcome was made. Now there is a growing recognition of the need to find ways of continuously communicating to the user in an easy to understand format how the bigger processes are happening. So let's say these long-term memory processes or corresponding data management or reasoning approaches. And that again remains an open challenge that me and my colleagues continue to explore. And of course, all these processes in turn affect the way the prompts are engineered, looping the process back to where we started our discussion. And finally, the overall goal of everything what we've discussed so far, of course, is to bring better task outcomes while ensuring a positive social impact, because that's the general goal of partnership, of collaboration. So just briefly, I'm going to mention some of the recently actively discussed issues in that area. The one is the unclear sense of ownership. So the increasing role of particularly generative AI systems in creative work started blurring these traditional lines of authorship and leading to uncertainty over who can claim the authorship, who can claim the responsibility for co-creations in this human AI collaboration. I'll provide some citations here to our recent work on this topic, but the main takeaway that I want to give here is that the sense of ownership, so the psychological ownership, is directly affected by the way the output is communicated to the user. And that should be getting dedicated attention in human AI communication design. That is not just a question to give some output to a user, but to communicate in addition the the perceived authorship on the system side, on what is the contribution from the system. Another big issue, of course, is over and under reliance. While our research actually shows that people do not blindly follow what AI suggests, there is evidence that these reliance dynamics are mediated by the structure of communication. For example, how interactive it is, so how much back and forth is involved in the discussion, which also suggests that we have to consider not just the way how the model itself processes information, not just the way how humans perceive a given output of a system, but in a more holistic, dynamic way for the discussion overall. The effects of task outcomes. Again, our research shows that there should be steering of conversation structure to achieve better outcomes depending on a domain and task context, which currently is not particularly supported, especially in general purpose agents. Some more specific agentic systems that are integrated in more nuanced contexts do a slightly better job at it. However, as I said, general purpose systems like ChatGPT and Claude do not really integrate any structured steering for different contexts. And finally, the issue of echo chambers and belief perseverance. It is a responsibility of AI agent designers to account for these dynamics in communication design. Currently, it is predominantly designed from the perspective of model adjustments. So what is happening on the way how the model processes the information. However, there is more to that on the way how the information is being presented. And again, coming back to, let's say, sycophancy processes, the way how information is being presented back to user. And I invite you to read more about the specifics of how we can be designing to address these responsibilities in the papers I mentioned here. Okay, so to summarize, today I wanted to give you an overview of a human-AI communication cycle and to show the role of communication in high-quality collaboration of human-AI agents. So we first discussed the difficulties that users face when engineering prompts for AI systems, and the difficulties that AI system, in turn, has when trying to correctly recognize the user's contextually defined intent behind this input. We then looked at the processes associated with forming and formatting AI output and the ways it affects the user's motivation to incorporate the information communicated by AI into the task, right? So including both trustworthiness and anthropomorphized perceptions of the system. And we also talked about how these in situ perceptions are related to users' mental models and general expectations on AI systems. And finally, briefly mentioned some big open questions related to the task outcomes that threaten the quality of human-AI collaboration. And of course, I'm not trying to say that that is an exhaustive list of the problems associated with the communication design to support human-AI collaboration, but hopefully I convinced you, at least to some degree, that the design of human-AI communication loop is essential for making AI agents truly useful. And with that, I would be happy to take your questions.
Okay, thank you so much, Anastasia. Thanks everyone for the questions that are going into the chat right now. We'll move into the discussion portion of our seminar. We do welcome questions from all participants. And as I said before, you can use the raised hand function. You can also write your question in the chat. And our team will ask you, our team is able to unmute you. So when it's your turn for your question, you'll get an instruction that says you can unmute. And if you're able to turn on your camera, that is great. All right, so I do have, let's see, I've got a question here. Okay, I've got a question from Steve Jordans. Steve, I don't know, are you here? Just wait a minute and see. I can read the question too. Okay. Maybe I'll oh, wait. So it should, I can't do the,
Yeah.
can I?
All good.
Okay, someone did it. All
I
right.
was trying to figure out, I was
Yeah, we
waving
have
my
people-
hands, but that wasn't good. I had to be digital.
Yeah, we have people in the background, I think, who now you're unmuted, at least on my end. Anastasia, you can hear, right? Anastasia, it looks like you are muted now, though.
I muted myself just because I was.
Oh, you muted yourself. All right. Okay, so here we are. So Steve, go ahead. Let's start with your question.
It was just a thought I had as you were going through the talk. You know, when you were showing that nice chart about how humans, if they're uncertain, you see all these changes in their nonverbal aspects of their communication, which is fascinating. And that's sort of what the AI agents don't do right now. And the question is it because they can't do it? Like, in order to do that, when I try to imagine, like I was just teaching a class this morning and I was talking about some concept and I was listening to myself talking. And as I was listening to myself talking, I'm not convincing myself. I'm like, oh, wait a minute, this isn't, and probably my vocal features changed, you know, as a function of that. But it required the knowledge that, hey, wait a minute, is this making as much sense as I thought it was making? And it seems to me when we have conversational AIs, they have no basis for that knowledge. So they can't, you know, appropriately change. So do you have ideas about where that basis, am I right? First of all, are there potential bases? And if we could find them and integrate that, I think that would be a huge advantage.
Thank you so much, Steve, for the question. Yes, you're right. That is pretty much half of the research that we do in the group, trying to find that basis and figuring out those mechanisms. The reason, so one part of your question was why the current systems are not doing it now. I'm not going to talk for any particular company. I'm going to just express my opinion why that is happening. I think that, so, okay, we started knowing that there are some mechanisms behind that. We also start slowly developing a sense that it seems like the mechanisms are not exactly the same as in human-human communication. So you would think, like, we have hundreds of years of knowledge on human-human communication. Why can't we just take and use that for human agent? Well, it doesn't seem to work exactly the same as I mentioned, let's say, on that example of trust calibration through communicating levels of certainty through paralinguistic cues. To start, I assume that to start implementing that on the general product level, we need to be absolutely sure that how exactly it works, right? So that we can have the full responsibility of what exactly is being understood. And interpretation is a hard question to address with certainty. So I think that is just, the research is happening on that. There is a lot of interest, including interest from industry, in understanding these processes. Basically, I just think it's going to take some time for us to make sure that the mechanisms that we're establishing are basically to make sure what are the generalizability boundaries for the mechanisms that we're establishing. And another aspect to that is the more people interact with agents, the more our social norms and interpretation norms and communication norms with agents change. So let's say we did this research a couple of years ago. One of the goals is to double check whether it's still going to be the same as people, let's say, started actively using voice agents with other types of models or with different models. Lots of interesting questions to explore there. But you're right that it takes time to get integrated into product.
Okay, so next we have a question from Reem Ayad, and then I've got Rachel Katz and Omid Shokarlahi, and then also Brian Harrington's classrooms. That's the order we'll go in. So Reem, do you want to? Okay, great. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Anastasia. It was such an interesting talk. I loved how you organized everything in a diagram and kind of focused on each element. It really helped me conceptualize my own work in a more clear way. So it seems to me that the talk was more about using AI as a tool. So the user would have a goal and the AI would try to understand that and kind of help the user fulfill that goal. I'm wondering what your sort of intuitions are about what would be particularly relevant to focus on in the context of AI companions or AI romantic partners, where kind of like the objectivity of the communication and the certainty that we're trying to get is kind of just slower, just by nature of the relationship. It's sort of harder to say what's the right thing and what's the wrong thing to say. So yeah, I'm just wondering if sort of your model, do you think your model would apply in those kinds of situations, or sort of what would be different?
Thank you so much, Ree. Yes, it would apply. In fact, we have some people in my group who are focusing specifically on those social interactions with agents. I actually had, when I was preparing this presentation for the second step, when we talk about AI interpreting the intent behind the prompt, I originally had the part there about the about interpreting the emotional weight of what is being put in the prompt. I got rid of that because it wasn't fitting into the overall story, but I think the whole process still fits, and the same loop of collaboration would still be the same. A lot of issues that we're discussing, let's say, was the illusion of sentience for the mental models, or the perceptions of processes. It's just here you would be talking more on the processes of, let's say, attention and processes of like emotional processes, or this illusion of empathy would all still would be the same and still would be on that sixth step of the mental model. For the perception of the output from the agent, as well as the anthropomorphized perception that I briefly mentioned here, again, the questions of how we are, what are we communicating when an agent talks, right? So there is the content of the message itself, and then there is a lot of additional information within the message that supports the what we call the information decoding, but like basically for the user to understand what the model means. And right now we have rather poor understanding of how to control those processes, so how to affect those processes. And while there is a lot of recognition for the need of some policies around these processes because of these emotional reactions from users, or for the need of the ability to control, to manipulate that perception, right now there is quite little is known. So yes, the whole thing that we were discussing before still holds.
Thank you.
Great. So now Rachel. And okay, yep, great.
Hi, can you hear me? Okay, perfect. Thank you so much for your talk, Anastasia. It was very interesting. I have two sort of short, I think, questions, both kind of on the topic of reliance and perhaps over-reliance on these sort of conversational AI tools. And those are how you determine that people are not blindly relying on these tools. And two, how do we encourage like the right kind of prompt engineering? I'm using right in big scare quotes because I'm a philosopher. I don't believe that there's necessarily one right way, but I guess sort of from that perspective as well, I would say like I'm not someone who necessarily knows how to think of the most like efficient or most useful kind of prompt to give one of these systems. And I think sort of like down, if we look at kind of broader or perhaps certain kind of contexts, it can be quite important that the right kind of prompt is generated. So yeah, I'm curious about both of those things.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Both are fantastic questions. So for the first one, how do we know that people are not necessarily blindly relying on AI? Well, I can explain how we did that in that specific study, but before I mentioned that, there is a huge methodological gap related to a lot of human AI studies, because again, we cannot just apply whatever we have in like let's say in psychology, but we also cannot use a lot of the classical methods from HCI. So it is a very interesting time to do human AI research. What we did in that specific study that I was mentioning, we were looking at the, so we were asking people to produce, so we were asking people to produce some explanation, some rationale. Then we were showing them some AI input output for the similar task. And then we were asking to produce the final output from the user. And we're looking at what are the portions of the AI output are taken in the final version and what portions of the original thinking that people had remains in that final output. However, that I think for each case right now, it has to be very carefully designed for each given study. And unfortunately, right now, there is no more systematic way of approaching that. Again, that is something that we're slowly working on developing this better methodological toolkit for addressing those problems. But if you would like to collaborate on that, I would be very happy. And then for the second part on how to help people formulate better prompts. Well, that's why I mentioned it among these big open questions right now that we have. There are different strategies that are being suggested. Predominantly, they include some interaction back and forth currently with the agent. There are attempts to use different modalities as well. So instead of just asking a person to give some prompt, then you can also use, let's say, some feedback loop on how the system understands that prompt. However, again, there is we don't know. Basically, the short answer to that we don't know, and we're trying to find ways for specific types of communication. Because again, let's say social communication with let's say AI boyfriend versus work communication, let's say when you're making a decision with some enterprise agent versus your personal writing agent. Let's say that this would be different processes of how to guide those prompts.
Okay, all right, great. Thank you. So now we'll go to Omid and then Brian Harrington in that classroom that'll be next. So I think that one might have some logistics to think about there. So Omid, go ahead, please.
Hello, Anastasia. Thank you very much, very, very much for this inspiring and thought-provoking talk. And I'm really passionate and enthusiastic about the focus of the research in Cookie Lab and I'm really optimistic about its future direction. So I'm a researcher. I'm a PhD researcher in the field of context calibration of multi-agent of large language models, and I'm working some interdisciplinary studies on how it is possible to think about the cultural clash when two people from different cultures or different abstraction layers of language just meet with each other, and then how the communication between them could actually be facilitated. So I'm just want to know about your opinion or even your past observation in the literature about such kind of topic. So how is there some studies on the sensitivities on this that we should consider during such kind of interactions? Because today's world is witnessing a lot of political polarizations, different changes in our environment, and a lot of intercultural problems that are happening because we are coming from different cultures or different backgrounds together. And then there are a lot of sensitivities in this problem, this world problem, and how researchers have addressed such topic.
Thank you so much, Ahmed. Very promising area that you're working on. There is definitely a lot of research from I would say from different angles, looking at this problem from different angles. One aspect there is what models are used on the back end for to support such processes, right? Are we talking about one generalized model? Are we talking about, let's say, two smaller size models that then talk to each other? So, like more on the processing side. Another aspect to that is what I mentioned with the context dependency on the, sorry, my screen is there, on the context dependency for the intent recognition. That is where these issues come as well. So let's say for the model, when it's talking to a user from a slightly different cultural background, how to ensure that it interprets the user well. So I think when you're talking about an agent that helps two people, the problems are still the same. The agent needs to understand what each of these people mean when they're talking, and then already help to understand each other. So I would look at the context dependency in intent recognition. I would look at the questions of the literature on responsible AI in supporting multicultural interactions, and then interactions within different cultures. So to see, again, where this trade-offs between having bigger models that account for different, let's say, cultural nuances versus having more specific models that then learn to talk to each other. And what else I would recommend? The perceptions again. So let's say the perceptions of information that we're talking about with the reliability and objectivity, or even anthropomorphized perceptions, they would also significantly differ in different cultural contexts. So again, I did not mention it here, but we were looking at it, let's say, we're starting to look at it in the context of, let's say, North America versus Asian countries, in the way how these chatbots are used in more social, conversational agents are used in more social settings, and what are the expectations that are assigned in one and in other cultural contexts. And of course, they significantly differ, and the interpretation of the same piece of information significantly differs. So very promising topic, but there are a lot of different angles.
Are you also interested, or maybe have some positions in your lab for such kind of research?
Please reach out and we can discuss that.
Thank you.
Okay, so Brian Harrington's classroom, and I see someone has come before the camera. Is there? Okay, go ahead. I think you're off mute. Yeah.
All right. Sorry, can you hear me right now?
Yes.
All right. First of all, Anastasia, thanks so much for the talk. Found it really insightful. So yeah, during that talk, you mainly talked about like the human-computer interaction aspects of agents, where we presume like a human is interacting with the agent. So my question more so relates to the idea of agent-to-agent communication. So like obviously that concept of anthropomorphized perceptions is pretty important, right? When your agent is talking to you as a person, right? I'm wondering though, like in purely agent-to-agent systems, like I'm assuming the role of that anthropomorphization is like less important, obviously, because if it's a machine to machine, you're just like trying to optimize for some process, right? But in the case where you have like multi-agent systems communicating also with humans, how do you know where to strike a balance between that? Or like when you have multi-agent systems, where maybe one agent, they kind of work together in sequence, where like maybe agent 2 is reliant on the output of agent 1. So like in those types of systems, how do the agents kind of like determine like confidence, or like how can they I guess similar to like when a human communicates to just one agent, like how does the other agent determine the validity of agent 1's response? So like yeah, that's what I was curious on.
Thank you so much for the question. Very exciting and insightful question. Unfortunately, my answer is going to disappoint you, because my answer is I don't know.
Yeah, that's all right.
But you're right that right now a lot of research starts moving from this dyadic relationship to more group relationships in interactions, where there might be several human agents, several AI agents with different combinations of interaction processes. I think that when we're designing, we're still designing some aspect of interacting with a human, right? Because if the agents are just talking to each other, there is no particular, so you would be designing those aspects if you, let's say, as a human, need to control what is being communicated between agents, which again includes the questions of your ability to understand, your comprehension of what the agent outputs, right? And your your perception of the value of whatever the agents output between themselves. So I think whenever we start talking about anything that human faces, we come back to the questions of interpretations and perceptions. That being said, the questions of group dynamics in conversations with multiple agents, there is, again, there are different angles to look at it. There is a mathematical side of looking at it when you are just trying to model different processes that are going to be happening with agents assigned different roles. And then there are social aspects related to that. When you were talking about, let's say, when a new person comes into such group, how they would be perceived. New area, very new area. There was, so on the modeling side, there is a little bit more work that has been done for actually quite a while already. But on the social side, on the interaction design side, that is an extremely new topic. So if you're interested in that, I would be happy to collaborate. And with my colleague, Matt Rattle, we're actually having several workshops that are discussing these questions that are related to the questions of group dynamics, and let's say what is the group context versus individual context, group memory versus individual memory, and what role it plays in all this communication dynamics.
Okay, thank you. So, and since you just mentioned Matt Ratto, Matt, I see you just wrote a question in the chat. Are you able to ask that? This might be a good moment for that. Maybe I can read it if, oh, you're, okay, thanks. Hi, nice to see you.
No, I'm good now, thank you. They unmuted me. I'm sorry, I had to switch to my phone. My laptop died in the middle of it, but I actually was asking, I wanted to ask Anastasia to think a bit about how that move from interaction to communication offered us a potentially way to sort of overcome some of the microtransactional and sort of like limited dyadic ways of thinking about relationships, and in particular, how calm may allow us to sort of incorporate the broader social context in which most of our human activity is taking place. And specifically, I just mentioned one example of that being the social determinants of health, and how that might be incorporated into, for example, how health agents, conversational agents, and things like that operate.
Thank you so much, Matt, for the question. I think it does. Whether it's the ultimate solution, I don't know, but definitely at this point, I think as a shift of the paradigm from pure interaction to communication, I think it addresses some of the challenges that you were pointing to in your question. I think it's more on the question of interpretation. So I argue that it's communication because of that interpretation element, but I think the interpretation element itself is key for moving beyond how you call them microtransactional accounts. Because that is where, let's say, the complexities of information we're taking into account come in. That is where the complexities of different levels of abstraction of, let's say, social information to personal information comes in. This is where all the nuances of quote unquote factual versus quote unquote subjective information come in. So yes, I think that it definitely opens up a lot of avenues for the further development, but it doesn't answer it on its own, but it opens the way for further research there.
Thanks, Matt. So I see Steve, I think, has a follow-up from earlier, and I have a question too that I'm going to come to next. Brian Harrington may or may not still have the hand up, or there might be another question from that room. So we'll come to that perhaps if there's time. Steve, do you want to go ahead and ask your follow-up or your new?
Sure, and I think it might be a pretty quick one, but a really interesting one. You got me thinking about the echo chamber thing, and we had a little bit of a discussion. It seems like we can even build this into prompts where, right now it does a lot of what we psychologists call confirmation bias, where if you're looking for something and you're saying, hey, I think X is true of Y or whatever, is there a good reason? And it'll tell us, oh yeah, there's a bunch of good reasons for believing that. It would be very easy to build into these AIs but there is a counter argument Would you like to entertain that? And just by asking that, I think you're pushing people who usually live just within confirmation bias to go, oh, and it's hard to say no. And my goodness, might this be good for society if people were forced to consider counter arguments to things they believe? Confirmation bias is so huge. What do you think of that?
Yes. A very important question. I agree with the need of bringing up new perspectives. One of my PhD students, Paula Akemi, she is actually focusing her whole PhD research pretty much on this premise. And when I was talking about echo chambers on my slides, I mentioned one of our recent papers from this year, when we're showing how different models tend to bring different perspectives when they're asked to, so perspective in a sense of cognitive perspective taking in assessing social situation, right? So if let's say we're asking to assess whether something, let's say, sexist or not, so to look at it from the victim's perspective, from the perpetrator's perspective, from the decision maker's perspective. So we're showing the necessity of assessing models, not just based on this ground truth, evaluating models, not just based on the ground truth metrics of what they're bringing up, but also on the distributions of, let's say, perspectives that they're bringing, because sometimes we want to highlight and use the model that brings more perspectives and more combinations of perspectives in its reasoning. Sometimes we actually want to have something more kind of like quick and dirty, right? To just give me an opinion right now. So yes, definitely we're developing this idea of how to integrate models input into this subjective decision making. Subjective, again, when we need to consider different perspectives like hiring decisions or judiciary cases. How to integrate models and evaluate models on their suitability for this subjective decision making. And I would be happy to continue talking about that, because I also believe that that's the future, basically.
If your student needs an external committee member for a thesis, I'd be happy to. Thank you for your talk today, Anastasia. I learned a lot.
So I'm going to take moderator's privilege and just ask a quick question about how linguistic specificity might be a problematic in the work. And, maybe this is outside the scope of what you're talking about and what you're doing research on. But I was thinking about, say, for example, that the idea of trust calibration and kind of disambiguation in prompt engineering, and thinking about each language has its way of signifying how much level of certainty. And I was thinking about languages that have evidentiary markers. Just one that comes to mind is Turkish, where you can say, I've heard this, right? This has been said to me to be the case, with just a simple particle that goes into the word. And you don't have to say a lot, right? So there are some languages where there's the evidence behind what you're stating is very much baked into the syntax. And then there are languages that don't, and that do it with, more contextual forms of narration, right? English being one of them. So that's just one example, but I was wondering if you had any kind of experience with thinking about linguistic specificity in the models, if any of the results that you found could be talked about here. I'd be very interested to hear about that.
Thank you, Avery. You are, of course, surfacing a very big issue of cultural focus in research overall, and yes, in our research too. We're trying to get to broader cross-cultural models and, let's say, cross-language models. One day when I'm going to have a lot of money and I'm going to be able to build a huge team that would be working, let's say, on the same problem, but from different language perspectives, that would be extremely interesting to consider. I think you are absolutely right that there are, of course, nuances that would be to each language and to the, let's say, intonation. So it's not just the language, not just the structure of, let's say, what we write, but the way how it is pronounced, the way how it is interpreted. The way how I see that can be that we can start approaching it now is to start seeing whether the differences in the way we perceive that or interpret that in human-human versus human-agent communication are consistently different. Because if we start seeing that there is some patterns in how human to human agent is different, then we can be building on the decades, hundreds of years of research on each particular, let's say, language, right? And then we can start, instead of having to explore everything from scratch again, if we can understand the transition formula from human to human agent, that might be direction towards it. But again, I think that's a very high goal. We're moving to that very, very slowly, but we're getting there, I think.
Yeah. Every language is its own ecosystem, right? Okay, very interesting. Thank you. So I do see that there's, not with a hand up, but a question from Vera. And I don't know if, Vera, I don't know if you were hoping to ask that live or.
I was just, I don't know. I suspect that there is an answer that could be crafted to this question. I anticipate perhaps it could be around incentives and understanding, like some sort of measurement of incentives and whether incentives are aligned or not, and what could be done to align them. But there's sort of a philosophical question of how can we talk about the communication and cooperation of a human and an AI when they sort of don't live the same way in the workplace. The human kind of earns a wage and they can be fired, and the AI is possibly being actively maintained by humans who are in a sort of contractual relationship with whoever is, pay, like the company that's paying for the service, but ultimately the AI is a kind of congealment of past human labor that can't be fired. How can these two things cooperate?
Thank you so much, Vera. I would love to answer this question in collaboration with you, and we can even write, I think, a grant towards that. Huge question. Nobody really knows how to address that from what I know. Again, it's a little bit closer, I think, to your area, but from what I'm familiar with, nobody really knows. But from the communication perspective, I think there are at least two important questions related to to the issue that you just raised. One is the importance of shared experiences for building this long-term collaboration. And what does it mean for an agent to have an experience? And what does it mean for a human to have shared experience with an agent? There's some interesting research from the philosophy perspective when we talk about moral tasks and the way how, like, let's say in game theory, the distribution of different roles, and let's say within collaborative games, the way how people assign this perceived benefits to the other social entity, right? In this case, it is AI. So I think that that might be an interesting direction to look at when we're thinking about what does it mean for a human to recognize agent's experience. I don't think that that is something that exists right now, and I'm not entirely sure that that is something that we should directly design as is. But you're right that the way how we now think about human-human collaboration has to involve some shared basis, right? So some sort of experiences that people share. And another important issue here is the accountability. So the perception of accountability when humans communicate in this human-like style in the conversation with AI. I think that is, so when I was talking about the dangers of anthropomorphization, I mentioned that the issue is that it might lead to the wrong expectations. And when we're talking about the mental models, again, these ideas of how processes are happening, the issues of people not having enough mental models of both the abilities and the processes of the models lead to this, I think it's a mindless transition that we're used to have that perceived accountability on the other side when we talk to people. So when we start having human-like conversation, it happens with agents. That being said, I think that as I mentioned earlier, these social protocols and practices and communication practices with agents are also not static, and they keep developing every day. And so being a techno optimist, I think that is going to take a little bit of time to develop and to get a little bit more established. But I think as it gets established, we will start getting closer to being able to answer your question.
Okay, thanks, Vera. I see Brian Harrington's classroom. There's someone in there. I think that'll be the last question. And thanks to everyone. Let's see, are you?
Thank you, Professor.
Okay.
Thank you for a precise time. And I just want to ask a brief question about to see the big picture. Is AI agent acting more like human beings, or is it making its own mindset, but just acting like human beings? Or is it just the mindset of human beings? Thank you.
Thank you. Big question. I'm sure that all of my colleagues here would have also their opinions on it. So, of course, is it a human? No, it's not a human. What does it mean to think human-like is an all-time question. Is it learning the logic, let's say, and the reasoning on the similar examples and data that humans do? Yes, it does. Are we evaluating models on the similar processes that we would be evaluating, let's say, human cognitive abilities? Often, yes. Actually, there is a law that is being directly borrowed from psychology, let's say cognitive psychology, in the way how we're assessing the model's capabilities. I think there are kind of two questions there. One, about the core nature of what that thinking is. And let's say even in cognitive science, let's say cognitive psychology, you would find many different schools of thought of what a cognition is and what does it mean to replicate, and whether it's possible to replicate human cognition. But then there is a question of how it should be. In a sense, should we keep developing as designers of systems? Should we keep developing algorithms to mimic or to attempt to mimic human processes, versus should we have a unique AI pathway for the development of what it is strong? There is lots of fantastic thinkers on both sides, I would say, of this, in both camps on this question. I personally, at least at this moment, I'm personally more on the AI unique side. So I think that in my research, at least, I look at it more as in highlighting unique AI capabilities rather than trying to learn how to mimic. However, again, the truth is probably somewhere in the middle, as it always is.
Thank you so much. The truth is somewhere in the middle. And thanks, Anastasia. I particularly enjoyed learning the phrase sycophancy management. It's a wonderful thing to think about. Thank you so much for this fascinating presentation and really very interesting Q&A. Thanks to all the presenters, or the participants and the presenter, for such a great session. And please join us next week. So October 8th, we've got another seminar. We'll be welcoming Ryan Callow, Lane Powell, and D. Wayne Gettinger Professor at the University of Washington School of Law. He'll be talking about his new book, Law and Technology, A Methodical Approach. For details and to register for this seminar, please visit our SRI website. You can also click on the link that's been placed in the chat. So thanks again to everyone. I hope you have a wonderful day and see many of you next week.
Thank you so much.